Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Jean Pfaelzer, the author of California, a Slave State. This is her fourth book. She's a professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Pfaelzer.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. In 1850, in exchange for allowing the potential of slavery in New Mexico and Utah, California was admitted to the Union as its 31st state, a free state, the land of beaches and beautiful scenery and bridges and one day Hollywood. But even to today, Dr. Pfaelzer argues California has been anything but a free state. While we may not imagine plantation slavery there the way we do in U.S. southern states, there absolutely were Black Americans forced to work in bondage, and slaves of other races and nationalities have also existed there. The indigenous, the Inuit, the Chinese, and even people from India. So first of all, Dr. Pfaelzer, when and how did you realize that the story of California, that the story of slavery in California had been written out of our collective consciousness?
It's an important question because I think it had been written out of many of our collective individual consciousness, and even those of us like me who grew up in California. I was born in LA, went through the public school system, did a BA and MA at Berkeley in American history, American studies, and didn't learn this. I stumbled on this story when I was finishing my last book, Driven Out: The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans. And in this book, California, a Slave State, there's an image of a girl. She looks maybe 13 to 15, and she's behind a cage. And when I looked into this picture, this Chinese girl was an enslaved prostitute on Jackson Street in San Francisco. And as I looked at it, I kept saying, what happened to the 13th Amendment? How did this happen in the 1870s and 1880s after a civil war against African American plantation slavery? So that was a shock to me to realize the endurance of slavery after the Civil War. And then the story goes backwards from there and forwards to the present with human trafficking.
Are these stories and narratives, and this is, I guess, in general, but it could be specific to California and the issue of slavery, are these stories and narratives specifically and purposely written out, or does it happen over time by way of habit?
I think our country is having a massive reckoning with race. And the erasure of stories is both deliberate and inevitable. If we were a country where until 1844 in New York, women weren't allowed to own property in their own name, where the inequalities of race, the genocide of Native American people, stories were erased because people couldn't tell them, because people were slaughtered, because tribes were moved. One part of the definition of slavery is the forced transport of people. And if you move people away from their homelands, their families, their lullabies, their songs, that you lose their history. So part of it's inevitable, and part of it was that books weren't allowed to be published. Stories weren't allowed to be published, tales weren't allowed to be told, and they were erased legally. If you're not allowed to testify in court, how can you leave a legal record of your economic and lack of justice in history.
The quote that you use from Frederick Douglass at the beginning of the book about how great streams and rivers fade away, leaving behind branches and rocks, and the comparison that he makes between that and the stories that nations tell themselves. Why did that resonate with you when it comes to California?
I think because I didn't know. It resonated with me because I trapped in sounds of silence, that I hadn't heard these stories, I hadn't studied them, I hadn't read them. And like many, I thought of slavery as a North-South tragedy, a North-South economic, racial, social, legal system. And I didn't take it West. Lately, we've done a much better job of taking it to the North than taking it to the West. We know now that all of those mills in New England that were weaving cotton, where did they get the cotton from? We know that New York considered seceding from the Union, which is just shocking. Like, we don't think of New York as a secessionist state because all of the profits in the port of New York that was the crossroads between the South and the North. Everything that was going north was going through New York. And New York knew if slavery came to an end, cotton tanked, that port would be in trouble. So slavery contaminated a lot of spaces.
I feel like we have this neat little definition in our heads of what slavery is and what it means. I think in popular culture, we picture a Black man or a woman in chains in the South, tired, working in the fields, dirty, sweating in the sun. How does that definition conceal the realities of what the word slave actually means? And I want to be clear, it may mean those things and mean that, but how does that simple view that we have of it in popular culture conceal the larger meaning of what it has meant in North America and the United States?
Well, that image that you just created is an epicenter and the definition of slavery. And that image actually existed in California, except there it wasn't African Americans, it was Native Americans who were working in the fields, being forced to transform their own native lands into plantations. It doesn't include other kinds of agricultural labor, and agriculture is really well suited to enslavement. You need a massive number of workers who can be controlled, who can be geographically set aside. So the image of the sweating plantation worker that you just posed is true, but that doesn't include the female African Americans on the plantation, and it doesn't include the Native Americans who were enslaved by the missions. It doesn't include the Alaska Natives who were brought into California for the otter trade. It doesn't include convicts who were enslaved within prisons and tortured if they didn't work to support California agriculture. It doesn't include Chinese girls, even Chinese babies who were kidnapped from the ports of China and brought here. It doesn't include human trafficking. But if we spiral back to your image of someone, a man working in the fields, you'll find that man in California up in the hills of Humboldt County in the marijuana groves.
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
What were the conditions of and just I want to give a little bit of background here for folks who may not be super well versed in the Compromise of 1850, and that might include me. What were the conditions of the Compromise of 1850 that created this sort of opening for California to become a slave state, even though it was deemed a, quote, free state?
Well, there were several conditions, but one was that California could come in as a free state. The other areas who were going to become part of the United States could decide for themselves if they were going to come in slave or free. So that was part of the deal, was that if California came in as a free state, the other states were good for go. They could choose to be slaved or not. But probably the most dangerous part of it was the third part of the trifecta, and that was the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And what that meant was that any African American who fled from slavery could be captured in a free state and returned. And that opened the door for the capture of free Blacks as well as enslaved Blacks across the United States to be seized and transported or sold back in the South. So it was a 3-part deal, and all of it tolerated slavery, and there was no enforcement in writing California's Constitution that California really, really would come in as a free state.
I'm curious about how the physical size of California impacted all of this. Not only do you have a giant state, but you have a really diverse terrain. You have shorelines, you have mountains, you have thick forests, you have very large clearings, you have desert, you have fog, you have lakes, you have weather that really changes a lot from north to south and east to west, and sometimes from 1 minute in one direction or the other. How did all of that contribute to the potential for human exploitation?
Well, it sounds like you've spent a little time in California.
I have actually, but yes.
And maybe you love the state as much as I do.
It's beautiful. And I had a wonderful, not only semester there, but I have cousins there and I've taken several vacations there. So I do love California. And that's why reading your book, I was like, a slave state, what? But go ahead. Yes.
I think the geography of California invited and made possible all different kinds of slavery. There's so many ways to look at it. If you look at the southern border, the first slavery in California is when the Spanish invade at San Diego. And they come by sea and they come by land. Father Junipero Serra, the first Spaniard to be sainted in the United States, crosses the border with the intention of converting, because he had a papal bull, an order from the Pope, to convert over 300,000 native Californians, Indians, to Catholicism. Interestingly, they had a pretty good number of how many Native Americans they were talking about. So you've got Mexico to the south with the tradition of slavery, Spanish slavery in the silver mines in Mexico, in Peru, and Spanish colonization. You've got the Russians coming down from the north just at the same time for the otter trade, because they've crossed the Bering Straits, they've captured Alaska natives, and they turn right and head down the Pacific coast, and they clash with the Spanish just north of San Francisco in Marin County. They clash in the wine country. And so you have that. You have 250 Native American tribes in California, and they are enjoying and thriving for between 6,000 and 12,000 years, the ecology that you describe. It was a fertile, fecund, beautiful state. There's salmon, there's sturgeon, there's trout, crab in the oceans. There are deer, there's berries, there are cama lilies, there's food. There were very, very few wars between California Native tribes just because of the geography that you describe. We know in relationships and in statehoods that scarcity is a bad thing and provokes competition, provokes hostility and violence. California did not have thousands of years of scarcity. A lot of what we valued, the Native people didn't care about. They didn't care about the gold flecks in the river, but they thrived off of this different geography and food sources and lived in harmony with it and honored it spiritually and in their tummies.
What I couldn't believe is that the name California itself is suggestive of slavery. Where did they get the name from?
They got it from a Spanish novel. It's this crazy Spanish feminist utopian novel about a Black queen named Calafia. And she's surrounded by these warrior women. And that's how the Spanish named California after her. Didn't know that. I didn't know that.
But from what I remember from just reading through the book quickly is that the name California itself suggested that there was a slave background and an exploitation background to this character who you just described.
Yeah, she was surrounded by these Black women slaves. It's a very weird and underread, underknown book. And I think it's more ironic and in some ways comical and ludicrous right now when we think that the name of the state is in honor of this royal woman in a state where women have struggled so hard for their rights, and women of color are struggling for their rights up through modern human trafficking, that the state is named after Calafia. It's just weird.
Yeah, I was like, boy, this is one of those things that a historian probably looks at and goes, well, I guess this fits into my book. And when you're a kid from New York, right? Like you're a kid from New York, you don't think about what the names of states mean, because New York, it's like you go to the museum and they tell you it's New York, New Amsterdam, New Jersey, all these things. And then there's a name with meaning out there, way out west. And so I want to ask, how did the fact that California is far away from the traditional, of course, not all, but the traditional seats of American power, DC, New York, make it easier for bondage to flourish?
Well, those were 3,000 very important miles between enforcement, jurisdiction, economics. By the time gold is discovered in California in 1848, and it becomes a state in 1850, the East Coast is in big trouble financially. And when gold is discovered in California, even though it's 3,000 miles away, the East Coast banks had no money, and they were getting billions of dollars at the time, and in current money, even more so from the gold of California. So there was that distance. There was the sense that it was far away. we had just ended the war with Mexico, this really swift war in 1848, where we invade Mexico and we win 55% of Mexico. So we win Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, California, off and on parts of Texas. And so with that victory, there's this geographical distance between California and the East Coast that's not supervised, it's not known, it hasn't been explored, and there have been a series. I think one way to think about California is to think about it globally. The Spanish come first, then the Russians come, then it's owned by Mexico that has won its independence from Spain. And finally, we beat Mexico. And with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we seize the top third of Mexico. So there's that geographic space, and there's nobody's watching the store. We've just beaten Mexico. We're feeling victorious and triumphant. And we've also ended in 1808 the trade of slaves from Africa. So across the country, there is this need for a desire for unpaid agricultural labor. So it all starts to fit together.
I'm really curious, along with your personal observations of California, obviously you're a scholar. What were your sources for this book? How did you put this narrative and this story together?
I once wrote a little article called Hanging Out, a Research Methodology. And I did a lot of travel. I went to local historical societies. I had a fellowship at the Library of Congress that's sitting on all kinds of documents. I had the Bancroft Library, which is like a depository library at the University of California, Berkeley. And then I'm a friendly person. I just asked everybody I know. And some of the documents that came my way were sort of just their stories in themselves. There's a picture in the book of a Native American girl with a white family. And she's been sold to this white family to be a nanny. And so there's all these white folks and a Native American girl dressed in Western clothes. And I wanted a copy of that photograph that I'd seen somewhere. So I called the Historical Society, and the woman who answers, it was in this little town of Whiskey Town up in the Siskiyou Mountains. And she says, well, we're in the middle of the fires here, the fires of 2 years ago that were raged across Northern California. And she said, my husband's on the firefighting line. I really want your story told. So give me a couple of days for the fires to cool down. And she went into the locked little historical society at Whiskey Town to send me that photograph. So some of it came through archives, traditional archives, letters. The Beinecke Library at Yale has a Western Americana collection. They've got beautiful watercolors of a man who sailed with the Russians and the otter ships. And I was going to start the story later, and the librarian came over with this massive book, looked like the Guggenheim Bible.
And you said, uh-oh.
No, he
What
put
am I
it
going to
on
have
my
to read?
desk, and he said, Jeannie, you've got to start your book here. And it's with these watercolors of the captured Alaska natives transported into California, planted at a slave plantation that they build in Fort Ross in the wine country. And he said, this is where the story needs to start.
What was it like to study a state that you thought you knew super well. And you may know it super well compared to even people who live in California. But to have this veil pulled off of it in such a way where you're learning about the really dark places of North American history.
That's personally a really important question. I mean, that gets to my soul and my being, because I've got a rebel soul. I'm an activist. I was, active, everything from the free speech movement to the civil rights movement, which was in fact one movement, a different story, how those were linked. And I'm an optimist. My first book was on the idea of hope, the politics of hope. And that's who I am by personality, by my politics. And I think what made it possible for me to write this book was that at every single point, with every tribe, with every moment, the enslaved people fought back. And I fear that both by the title, California, a Slave State, and the reviews, that this will be seen as an expose only of slavery and not of slave revolt. And I dearly hope that the book is read widely, because it's a story of resistance. And that's how I came to terms with the story. And the very first slavery in California were the Kumeyaay Indians at the border, right over San Diego. And within 2 years of the missions, the Kumeyaay people charged down from the hills, burn the mission, and free all their people. And the Kumeyaay never go back to the missions. And the book ends with human trafficking, with the story of a courageous woman who flees from her trafficker at a motel in her shorts to get away from him. And she becomes an advocate for victims of human trafficking.
And I do want to get into...
I found my spirits in that book.
I do want to get into some of the more modern forms of slavery that we're talking about. So I do have a few questions about that. But before we get to that, I want to ask you, how did you study this topic as a white woman with a fair amount of privilege? You're a college professor. You've written several books. You have tremendous access not only to knowledge, but you have tremendous amounts of knowledge about our society, and in particular going through the moment that we're going through right now, where we're having this racial reckoning in this country. At least, I hope we are. What did you have to keep in mind about your place in society as you explored those who had literally no status at all?
What I found in this book, and equally, and maybe that gave me the courage to do this research in Driven Out, the Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, is that everybody I met with wanted their story told. That I did not have, I learned a lot about race, and I made a few mistakes that I cringe-worthy racial mistakes. But for the most part, people really helped me tell the story, rather than say, what is this white woman doing, appropriating this story of pain and struggle? And so, for example, one woman invited me, an Alaskan Native woman, a Dena'ina woman, invited me to come and travel with her in Alaska to meet the elders, because many of these stories are not written down. And we went to various places, and I just shut up and listened. I think shutting up and listening is always a good idea.
I want to get to some of the specific ways that slavery occurred in California. And one of the things that you mentioned, the Spanish and their initial sort of conquest of certain parts of California. But I want to ask, what happened under the Spanish in California that helped pave the way for this Russian-driven slavery, which I really knew, nothing about, but I was floored by it. How did that happen? And then what happened under, I guess you call it Russian conquest?
Well, I don't know that the Spanish paved the way for the Russians. I think they were fighting for land, fighting for geography. Spain wanted to expand north, and Spain viewed California as empty of everything but Native Americans. They didn't know there was gold here. They didn't understand the differences between Baja or Lower California and Alta California. I don't think that it set up a legal or economic tradition. And in fact, they were very tense about the Russians coming from the north. And very quickly, they threw up 2 new missions north of San Francisco to be a barrier against the Russians coming down from the north. So I don't feel like that's what paved the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think what paved the way was, one, the idea that it's called empty land, terra nullius, the idea that the Indians didn't count, that the land was empty of people and it needed invaders to thrive and prosper. The Russians came for the otters, and they set up a Pacific Slave Triangle, and they weren't really knowingly copying the slave triangle that we were all taught: molasses, rum, slaves, Africa. But they set up a trade that works for them, selling the otters to China. So I don't think Spain actually made it possible. What really makes possible the endurance of slavery in California was, once it's owned by the United States, California copies laws from Oregon, copies laws from the South, copies laws from the North that facilitate and tolerate slavery and make it possible to bring enslaved people into a free state and to grow it as a slave state.
Explain the Chinese Exclusion Act and how. Now we're going to come to a bit more modern American history, although not quite modern yet. But how did the Chinese Exclusion Act not just work to discriminate and to penalize people who shouldn't have been penalized, but how did that create the conditions where we could have large-scale oppression and subjugation of entire groups of people?
The Chinese Exclusion Act is 1882, and the story of slavery in California at many times is really gendered. There's a men's story of slavery and a women's story of slavery. And the Chinese story of slavery in California is highly gendered. Chinese men chose to come to California. And I don't like to use the word waves of immigrants, but indeed, one huge group of Chinese men choose to come to California for the gold rush, like the men from Chile and Argentina and Mexico and the East Coast of the United States. They wanted money, they wanted adventure, they wanted to get away from women, they wanted new experiences. And from the minute of the discovery of gold, men from all over the world came to California. The Chinese women did not choose to come to California, and they were impoverished, destitute, desperate, generally peasant or village children or girls, where a head of the clan or a leader in their family or their father sold them, or they were kidnapped off the streets and sent on ships to California. And there were slave dens at the port in San Francisco. where girls were stripped, inspected, sold. And then there was a room in Chinatown called the Queen's Room, where if you weren't sold at the dock, you were sold in Chinatown. So this is all before the Exclusion Act. California wanted Chinese people. They wanted the Chinese girls for sex, for access, and they wanted the Chinese men for labor. And when the Chinese men are persecuted up in the gold fields, they come down from the mountains and they support the economy of California. Like my dad, they entered the service sector. You know, that's what immigrants do with laundries and restaurants and boarding houses and field labor. So the turn in what turns into the Exclusion Act of 1882 is really created, but it wasn't the way Chinese people entered this country. And even now, what we're seeing is we need immigrants. We've got fruit excuse me, we have fruit rotting in the fields in California. 2 years ago, the pears in California rotted in the fields, in the orchards, because there was nobody there to pick them. So this is a created racist kind of legislation that came with the economic depression following the Civil War, and it turns on immigrants.
How did African American slavery persist, and what do we need to know about the experience of African American slaves in California?
It was really unique because in California, about 2,000 enslaved African Americans, mostly men, but some women, come from the South, from Missouri, from Mississippi.
And about what year are we talking about here?
Oh, we're talking with the gold rush.
Okay, so 1850s, yeah.
Well, it starts in 1840, where they thought there was all of this land in California, but it gets big with the gold rush in 1848, 1849, and then the 1850s, where plantation owners are bringing their enslaved people to California, thinking that mining is really intense, muddy, heavy work, and they're going to have enslaved people do it for them, and they're going to get rich quick. So slaves were either marched across the plains to California, or they're shipped down to Panama. There's no Panama Canal yet. So they go toward a river called the Chagres River, and they get in these little boats through the jungle. And then the enslaved people carried all of the tents and mining equipment over the jungles. And then they come down on the Pacific side of Panama, and there are thousands of people hanging around waiting for ships to take them up to San Francisco. So that's the arrival of plantation slaves in California.
Was there ever convict leasing there?
Yes, but that comes soon. But what I just want to say about Blacks in California is what's unique is it's almost like a border state, like Maryland or Delaware or even New York, where enslaved Blacks meet free Blacks. And when they get to California, free Blacks who've come out for the same reason as everybody else say, hey, you're free. You are in a free state. And there's a very active early Black civil rights movement where free Blacks are raising money for the trials to pay white lawyers to free enslaved Blacks in a free state. It couldn't have happened the way it did without this really unique encounter between free and enslaved Blacks.
One thing that I've learned as a news reporter is that modern day slaves are hiding in plain sight. There are women and girls in particular being trafficked, but there are also men and boys who are trafficked not only for sex, but to sell drugs and to help grow drugs. And some are kept in jail for longer than they should be. What do we need to know about how slavery in California has persisted even to this day? And I was really interested to hear your story about watching the local news, or maybe you picked up the newspaper and saw a story about a young woman who had quite literally been a slave right under your nose and all of our noses, not to blame you, all of our noses the whole time.
I think modern slavery, which is what some scholars call it, or human trafficking, which is its more common name, is all over the place and it's right under our noses. Of the people who are trafficked in the United States today, about 90% are women. And we don't see them. We walk into our hotel room and they're changing our sheets. They could be the nanny of a family next door. They're weaving and sewing our clothes, our really California looking sporty, comfy clothes that look like our jammies, except they're, we get to wear them out now. And they're working
I'm
in
guilty
sweat.
of that. Yeah.
Hey, me
Yeah.
too. I'm into comfy. So modern slavery is all over the place. The story you're talking about, I did find in a newspaper. It was a 15-year-old girl, and it really compelled me to finish the book with modern human trafficking, modern slavery. 15-year-old girl she's been abused. She's hanging out in Hollywood. She's picked up by a couple of guys and they drive her up to the full length of the state, up to Lake County. And this is a horrific story to hear and to tell, but they lock her in a metal crate and they drill 2 holes, and one is to hose her down and the other is to prod her with a cattle prod. And they let her out to sexually service the men who were growing marijuana and to do the trimming, to trim the buds off the marijuana plants. And one day they take her to Sacramento, the state capital, and they lock her in a motel room while they go do the shopping for their farm. And there's a telephone, and she picks up the telephone and dials 911. And like most victims of human trafficking, she creates her own freedom. And the cops come and get her. She's traumatized. She doesn't want to testify, but she's freed.
And it's happening in the middle of, modern California, beautiful, gorgeous California. There are obviously laws, technically speaking, against slavery. Apparently, we need more. How should this book inform not just legislators in the state of California, but also the governor himself?
I think all of us need eyes wide open. And there are people who are telling us how to do it. If you go into the bathroom on many airplanes, or the bathrooms, especially women's rooms at airports, there's signs now written in several languages saying, "Are you okay? Do you need help? Dial this number." And the flight attendants now are keeping their eyes open for an older man traveling with a frightened young girl. And they call them out and they say, "I need to take you to the ladies' room now. It's your turn to go to the ladies' room." And then they take her to the front and they don't bring her back. So there are these incredible individual acts of helping people, but we need to know what to look for. At the end of my book, I talk about a woman who used the name Elle Snow, who was trafficked and kept in a motel, and she manages to flee while her trafficker goes out. And what Elle Snow did after she was freed and got a lot of help was to do training for healthcare workers and for cops so that they can spot trafficked people. When I drive off the freeway in Washington, D.C., where my home is, I drove off the freeway and you see people selling flowers, standing by the side of freeway off-ramps. Generally, those people are trafficked. If you see a girl struggling against an older man at an airport, likely she's fighting for her freedom. If you see frightened people working in motels, likely they've been trafficked. And we need to have the courage, and we also need to learn the languages to talk to them and to just say, are you okay? Can I help you? So it's really going to start as an individual movement. And then I'm hoping this book, as well as some brilliant books like Kevin Bale's book, The Slave Next Door, are really eye-opening to us that all of us are surrounded in this day and age by slaves, by people who are trapped and frightened and threatened. Often they do it by threatening their families. The woman who was trafficked up here, who's in my book, Elle Snow, her trafficker threatened her sister. I got you, and if you don't comply, I'm going to go get your sister, who was 16. So the threats to families are the same threats that they made to enslaved Blacks in California. If you flee, I still have your grandma back on the plantation.
I didn't have this question written down, but it occurs to me now.
Hmm.
What exists in the minds of the enslavers that enables them to enact this much cruelty over another human being? Have you been able to figure that out?
No. I think the sadism, the brutality, the greed I have lived with not only the stories that I found of people who'd been enslaved, and I tried to build this book off of the voices of people who were slaves, but I had to spend all these years also with these really brutal people. And at the end of the day, it's a level of rage and entitlement that Evan, I can't tell you that I know the answer to that. It transcends my ethical compass.
If you were going to design a monument that would raise public awareness over slavery, and Dr. Pfaelzer could design it the way she wants and put it where she wants and have it be to the specification, what would that monument look like in order to help the cause of ending trafficking and slavery in our modern society?
Well, I'm working on such a monument right now.
And how lucky am I? You can either give it away or not.
We didn't set up the questions for this interview.
We did not.
There is all over California now, but interestingly, it started up here where I am now in Northern California, in Eureka, in Humboldt County, that there is a monument to the Chinese people who were driven out of this town in 1885. And some of those Chinese people who were purged, one of 300 purges across the Pacific Northwest, some of those people were enslaved prostitutes. And our monument here, we've spent 2 years having this conversation. I'm not going to take 2 years right now, promise.
Well, we only have about 7 minutes. So,
but what the monument has is a lot of references to Chinese people. There is a moon arch to enter the monument.
It's like a statue?
No, it's
a room.
It's like an arch. It's like that you walk through, and it's a traditional arch that you would put in a Chinese garden, and to signify that it's Chinese, you'd recognize it as such if you saw it. And then there are stepping stones that begin with hope and end with hope, that mark the stages of the Chinese immigrants coming to California, the purges, the enslavement, the expulsion by ship. The city has given us land for this monument, and it's right where the Chinese were shipped out. And so you look from the monument over to Humboldt Bay, and then it ends up with return, resilience, resistance, return, and hope in these stepping stones that actually come from a tradition. You see it in Berlin and in Mainz, of the stepping stones where Jewish people were taken. And as you're walking through Berlin, you might have stepped on one that has the name and the camp and the date. So some of it we adopted from other monuments to horrific events of brutality, loss of freedom. And there are these beautiful stones that are person height that tell the story of the lack of freedom and the purges of the Chinese across the Pacific Northwest. And I also had the honor to work on one in Tacoma, where there's the Chinese Reconciliation Park, that there was a deal cut with the Army Corps of Engineers for 40 acres of land at the ocean. And that's a park where people have weddings and picnics and celebrations, but within it is a trail of expulsion that tells the history. So the idea is that these histories are easy and powerful and resistant and woven into daily life.
What other state needs a similar book to explore how people there have been exploited?
I think across the West, these books need to be written. I suppose the next one would be Oregon. Oregon had laws that banned Black people. And the government of Oregon, it was still a territory, and they had codes that said no Black person can remain in Oregon and no Black person can enter Oregon. And California's first legislature tried to copy those laws. Now, some people said, we actually want their labor. If we ban them from California, we're kind of sticking it to ourselves, because Native Americans did not want to do field labor, and they didn't want to mine. This isn't how they lived along these beautiful rushing rivers. But I think the history in the West almost needs to be told state by state, but then also needs to be put together, because this was all legal. And it was in the Constitution. There are 5 places in the Constitution that write in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And the Constitution was 1788, 1789. And they knew this was coming, and they built the Fugitive Slave Act into the Constitution. And when they write in the 5th, the 9th, and the 10th Amendment, which is you can't take anyone else's property, and human beings were property. Or if we don't outlaw it in the Constitution, you're good for go. All of this is pro-slavery legislation in the US Constitution. So it's both a local story and a national story that needs to be rewritten.
Have you decided, I don't want to be handing out homework assignments around here, but have you decided as to whether you'll do another book at this point?
The first book that I'll do, and I'll do it next year, is I'm sitting on a lot of stories that are not mine. That in collecting all of these stories, I think they need to go into the world so everybody and different groups of people can do with them what they want within their own traditions. So that'll be next, and it'll be a lot easier and to return the stories to the people they came from.
Dr. Gene Pfaelzer, the author of California, a Slave State. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your great questions, and thank you for welcoming me.
Thanks again. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.